You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is episode 9 of Ethnocynology. I'm your host, David Ian Howe, and today we're going to talk about some really cool science stuff. So a couple years ago in the summer of 2022, I was doing excavations at the Laprelle Mammoth site in Wyoming. I won't go into specifics where it is, but we found, digging there, what at the time was the oldest bone needle found in the contiguous United States. Hey Siri, text Spencer Pelton, is the bone needle at Laprelle still the oldest? And the bone needle might sound, okay, like it's not like pottery, it's not like a mummy, it's not, if you're thinking of archaeology, why is a bone needle, that important? A bone needle is in fact one of the most important things you can find at a site, especially for a Paleolithic or Paleo-Indian or just any kind of Stone Age site, especially in a higher latitude like that, in a cold place like Wyoming. And I had posted a video of us finding the bone needle on Instagram with one of those like viral sounds of like finding something cool. For the listeners, we're just, someone pulled a bone needle out of the ground, holding it with their hand, and everyone's kind of gathering around looking at it in like awe and amazement because it's so small, but so cool. And I posted that to Instagram, and a friend of mine who I met through Instagram that's followed me for years, her name's Camille, commented something that really stuck with me to this day. And according to this comment, it was 130 weeks ago. But she says,
I just find it amazing how something so small was so integral to everyday life and survival.
Now, Camille often posts things that are, great comments and just great commentary on stuff and starts discussions. But this one stuck with me for the simple reason of what she's pointing out, right? And yeah, it's not a mummy, it's not pottery, it's not a Roman mosaic. And even for Paleolithic stuff, it's not a mammoth tusk. And it's certainly not like a perfectly preserved Clovis point or something fascinating to look at, in that sense, in the weaponry sense. But a tool like that, remember, weapons are tools, and the way humans survive is making tools. And the way to survive in the Ice Age, especially in Wyoming, where it is fucking cold. I've been to -18 before there. Once you get past 0, it's all funny because and it goes into the negatives. It's all the same to me because you can't be outside for too long. Your breath freezes to your mustache or your beard. If you don't have a beard, maybe your lips freeze more. But, my mouth will freeze just for seconds of being out in the cold when your breath comes out. And back then, it was even colder because it was the Ice Age, and these people had to survive this environment. And Wyoming is so windy. It's insanely windy. I had a Jeep Wrangler, and it's such a boxy car, and it would get blown around on the highway, like when I was driving. So imagine mammoth hunting in the Ice Age out there on the plains. You'd need to have very warm structures. You would need to have very warm clothing. And again, as Camille pointed out, something so small is so integral to life back then. And I would have to agree. And actually, a paper recently came out on that bone needle itself because it's actually a fascinating tool that we found. Text from Spencer Pelton. Breed during might have an older one. Not sure how old that component is. Okay, either way, it's old. One of the oldest. Anyway, the people that I worked with at that site, a good friend of mine, Spencer Pelton, the state archaeologist, McKenna Latinsky, a PhD student at Wyoming, and several other authors who were my professors and people I've worked with, just wrote a paper in PLOS ONE called... And then what was the title of the paper?
Let me get it right. The title of the paper is like...
Spencer had to look it up. I was literally... For the listeners, they had to look it up. That's why we're laughing. And this is called Early Paleo-Indian Use of Canids, Felids, and Hairs for Bone Needle Production at the Laprelle Mammoth Site, Wyoming, USA. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how to read a scientific paper, talk about the bone needle, talk about bone needle production, and then also interview 2 of the researchers who I did in-person interviews with at the University of Wyoming who wrote the paper. I'll show you some excavation footage, and then also just kind of explain again why this is such a significant thing. And it's not like the biggest groundbreaking find, but I'll point out why this is important as we go, and it will start to make sense. So whatever you're here listening for, if you're interested in archaeology, interested in dogs or whatever, dogs are mentioned in this study. And also it is an important study. So we're going to dive in. And for those of you who have watched me for years talk about this stuff and talk about dogs, talk about archaeology, talk about Clovis, this is something that I am like deep in. Like, I love this. This is the coolest part of history to me, and we know so little about it, but also so much at the same time. So stick with me. This will be cool. Before we go any further, I'm going to get the boring part out of the way because I have to talk about this first. But the first thing you do when you see an academic paper, sometimes they're dense, sometimes they're 7 pages, sometimes they're like 70. It just depends on, what article or what journal it's in. This one is luckily 14 pages and several of those being references. The first thing you should do when you read an academic paper is read the abstract. Then you can read the conclusion. I often then read the methods and materials and I look at the results. There's several methods of which, especially when you're in school and you're handed 1 million papers to read a week, you need to get good at reading them fast and skimming them. If you're a teacher and you're upset with me saying that, you did it too. So what can you do? But here's the deal. You want to read the abstract, you want to read the conclusion, and then you want to read, you can read the introduction too, but you want to see the figures and the results that are in it so you can get a good picture of what it is. Then you're really intrigued, read the whole article. That's for people that are just, enthusiasts, not actually archaeologists. If you're reading this for school, definitely read the whole paper. But we're going to dive right into the abstract, and I'm going to read this. I got to put my glasses on for this because I'm getting old. Okay. Abstract. We report the first identifications of species and element used to produce Paleolithic bone needles. Archaeologists have used the tailored fur-fringed garments of high altitude. We report the first identifications of species and element used to produce Paleolithic bone needles. Archaeologists have used tailored fur-fringed garments of high-latitude foragers as modern analogs for the clothes of Paleolithic foragers, arguing that the appearance of bone needles and fur-bearer remains in archaeological sites circa 40,000 years before the present is indirect evidence for the advent of tailored garments at this time. I'll translate this all at the end. These garments partially enabled modern humans' dispersal to northern latitudes and eventually enabled colonization of the Americas circa 14,500 years before the present. Despite the importance of bone needles into explaining global modern human dispersal, archaeologists have never identified the materials used to produce them, thus limiting the understanding of this important cultural innovation. We use zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, zooms, and micro-CT scanning to establish that bone needles at the circa 12,900 years before the present La Prelle Mammoth site, Wyoming, were produced from the bones of canids, felids, and hares. We propose that these bones were used by early Paleo-Indian foragers at La Prelle because they were scaled correctly for bone needle production and readily available within the campsite, having remained affixed to pelts sewn into complex garments. Combined with a review of comparable evidence from other North American Paleo-Indian sites, our results suggest that North American early Paleo-Indians had direct access to fur-bearing predators, likely from trapping, and represent some of the most detailed evidence yet discovered for Paleo-Indian garments. So to translate that abstract into English, stone and bone largely preserves. Everything else is gone. It rots away, it's gone, gets eaten, gets soaked, gets disintegrated, it's gone. Clothing specifically. So we don't know exactly what their clothing looked like. I'm sure it was awesome. But if you can kind of picture something similar to like an Inuit parka, that's probably what they were wearing, or some kind of frock, something similar. We'll get into that later. I'll have Dr. Pelton get into the specifics of that later. And what the end of the abstract is saying, and like the point of the paper here, which I'll summarize in the beginning, but we can go into depth, is that like we would normally think bison and mammoth bone is what made the needles. But actually, since that's what they were hunting and processing at the camp, but actually, according to this evidence, it's they were using smaller predators like coyotes and foxes to make the tools, which, and we know in modern day, foxes give great furs and pelts and stuff like that too. So they're also doing this too. We don't have a lot of fox pelts that have preserved from this period. I don't think any. So it's kind of cool. To put it extremely simply, this study is about a bone needle found at a Clovis site. They analyzed what the bone needle was made of. And it not only changed the opinion of, it was probably mammoth or bison that they were using, but it also opened up a wider diet breadth, but it also opens up the window to a lot more other animals were being hunted at this time and used for their furs, apparently. And why that's interesting, which, again, we'll get into this, you can't really tell with really small bones when they're really small fragments and their needles and things like that. And fox bones and stuff like that don't preserve too well, they're crushed and stuff. And when you have fragments of bones, you can't really tell the difference without comparing those fragments to other fox bone fragments. It's just hard. But now there's a new method of testing these things with like pure science, which is called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, and we will get into that. That's the abstract. The next part of the paper would be the introduction, and then you have background research and methods and materials, and then later on you'll have your results, and then you'll have your discussion and conclusion. This one's a lot shorter of a paper, which makes it easier to use as a teaching aid, but for you listening to the podcast, not reading the paper yourself right now, what we're going to do is talk about the background research, how they set this up, and then how they tested that needle to find out what it was. And then we're going to go into the discussion and conclusion, interviewing the different researchers on like what their, thoughts and like what discussion this paper brought up. And it's pretty fascinating. So part 2, we'll be right back. The next part of the paper is the introduction. The introduction in this paper essentially gives the background information on the Laprelle site. Now, I made a video on the Warren Mammoth site, which was I think it's episode 3, and that was just a mammoth that was found in Wyoming ass up in a stream. It just was dead. It had nothing to do with people. We did the excavation to see if it was hunted by people. Nothing. But the other site that I've worked on, which I haven't made a full video on because there's like 3 videos I could make with this because it's a multi-year excavation, is the Laprelle Mammoth site, the one we're talking about. And I can throw up so much footage. I can give you a background information on this too, but I'm just going to let Dr. Pelton talk about it because he is the state archaeologist and has worked on this site for years.
I'm Spencer Pelton, the Wyoming State Archaeologist, member of the Office of the Wyoming State Archaeologist, which is part of State Parks and Cultural Resources here in Wyoming.
Can you give me a little quick background of Laprelle? I've talked about it enough on the channel, but just so people are familiar.
Yup. Laprelle is, as of right now, the oldest archaeological site in Wyoming, occupied by early Paleo-Indians. We have diagnostic artifacts from both the Clovis and Folsom archaeological cultures. Initially, it was a Clovis mammoth kill, a juvenile mammoth associated with a small assemblage of artifacts. So when we started excavating the site in 2014, we didn't know that it was a mammoth kill. We knew it was after 2014. And then since then, the site's just kind of gradually expanded and expanded and expanded. And so now the site is very much an early Paleo-Indian campsite with a mammoth kill in it. And around that mammoth kill, there's a bunch of really dense concentrations of artifacts that we argue represent the floors of houses that were occupied almost 13,000 years ago. Probably where people camped for, say, like 2 weeks to a month or something like that. A nice little clean snapshot in time of life in Wyoming almost 13,000 years ago during the early Paleo-Indian period.
And I don't have a huge large-scale production and animation team that can animate what this site looked like. I would love to do that one day. That's actually like what I'm working towards, is to be able to do that someday in my life, to be able to do that. Anyway, I'm going to have Spencer kind of paint more of a picture of what this site looks like, and I'll use some illustrations here too. And for people unfamiliar, would this campsite around the Mammoth kind of look like your cliche or quintessential, Paleolithic camp?
That's what it looks like to me. Every one of these little clusters has kind of a different character to it. Some of them are just scatters of flakes around probably a hearth. Another one of them has a really dense scatter of red ochre on the floor of the house. It looks like maybe people were processing hide or doing something with red ochre. A couple of the other areas are just really dense concentrations of flaking debris and end scrapers and stone tools, very much like heavily occupied houses where people were conducting a lot of activities. But yeah, it would have been kind of a bustling Paleolithic campsite with basically every activity you'd expect to find in those campsites occurring: foot napping and hide processing and building weaponry and repairing clothes for certain.
Among the many things I love about Spencer, being one of my best friends, he is an insanely intelligent dude. What he did for his dissertation was several things, one of which included going to Mongolia, living with reindeer herders, to understand how people keep warm and regulate space as nomadic people in the winter versus summer. It's really fascinating stuff. Anyway, I'm going to let him talk.
My dissertation was on thermoregulation, and it was really because I felt like it was a huge missing piece of this human behavioral ecological puzzle that archaeologists talk about a lot. Archaeologists talked a lot about food, the decisions people make to obtain food, which animals do they kill, how do they process those animals. And that's really been kind of the focal point of human behavioral ecology studies for a long time. But what I wanted to study in my dissertation was not just how you get calories in your body, but how you keep them in your body once they're there. And really what that comes down to is thermoregulation. We lose a lot of calories just through shivering and trying to thermoregulate our bodies in the absence of clothing. And clothing is really our way of mitigating against that. So I saw it as a big kind of missing piece of the puzzle of human behavioral ecology past. So I looked at that question in a couple different ways. One was through the Folsom archaeological record, the early Paleo-Indian archaeological record of the plains and Rocky Mountains, looking at that record to determine if these tools that we think should be associated with thermoregulation are found in greater frequencies in cold climates than in warm climates across the entire range of the Folsom territory, if you want to call it that. I also did a little bit of ethnographic work in Mongolia just to observe how people make and repair clothing in a modern context in a mobile pastoralists. And it really hadn't changed that much. I mean, people are still using inscrapers and they're still using perforators and needles and animal hides and all the same things that people were using 13,000, 40,000 years ago to make clothing. So I came away from those two projects with some pretty well-defined ideas of what thermoregulation should look like in the archaeological record. Two of those things were needles. You have to have needles to sew complex garments. There's really no other way around it. The other thing is the presence of fur-bearing animals, or what I called in my dissertation warm-skinned species, because it's not just fur, right? In some Arctic regions, people also use the skins of birds to make really warm weather garments, like eider ducks. But you can skin, you don't just pluck the feathers out and like stuff them in a pillow, right? You skin the bird and actually sew that skin into things like parka hoods and around the sleeves of parkas. So one expectation of my research was that we should find the remains of these sorts of animals in any Paleolithic context where people are making these fitted, tailored parka sort of garments in their cultures.
Something that Spencer hasn't mentioned that I'll throw in here. Part of his comps for his PhD was to literally sew a garment using a bone needle and hides to just get, understand it more. Because if you're going to do a PhD on this kind of thing, you should probably know how to do it. Interesting way to do a comp, also among many other questions and hours of writing papers and things like that. So with that research in mind, here's Spencer's take on why a bone needle is important and like why this is such a cool find.
I think a really simple answer is that they're extraordinarily rare globally. Even in the old world, we have 30,000 years of Paleolithic archaeology in the old world spanning 3 continents, basically. You can count on your fingers and toes how many sites have produced these bone needles. They're extremely rare, both because they're very fragile, but also because the recovery techniques that archaeologists typically use aren't fine-grained enough to recover these things on a consistent basis. You really have to be screening all your sediments through 16th-inch window mesh, basically, to find these things, unless you're super lucky or you're digging really slow and happen to find one in place. So there's that. It's just exciting to find rare stuff. Also, in addition to that, I think from a behavioral standpoint, there's no second guessing what a bone needle was for, really. It was for sewing. And we know that not all cultures sewed. And so it gives you a really direct line of evidence for a very specific behavior in the archaeological record that you really don't get with many other artifact types. Yeah. Maybe projectile points, but even then people argue projectile points. Oh, were they actually used to kill things, or were they knives? Yeah. Or an inscraper. Well, were they actually used to scrape things, or were they making wooden bowls or something? There's always a little ambiguity to like stone tool types. There's not with bone needles. And so finding that is just a great material correlate for a very specific behavior. And I think specific enough that we can say that they weren't used just to make any garment. They were used to make these very complex, tailored garments with fringe and very intricate seams sewn into them. Not like your typical kind of like frock or like the sorts of loose fitting garments that you find among ethnographic cultures on the plains in the historic record.
Yeah. And then I asked Spencer what the oldest bone needle in the world is.
It's about 35,000 to 40,000 years old.
So about the time Homo sapiens were.
Bone needles are uniquely modern human.
And would you say that's a solid reason we were able to colonize Europe?
I think it's a big part of the reason. Okay. I think it's a big part of the reason why modern humans were able to, for instance, inhabit ecological niches that Neanderthals were not. Because if you're bound to a thermoregulatory environment like a cave during the winter months, there's really no way you can expand your range way out onto like the plains of Siberia, because you wouldn't have anywhere to retreat to, right, when things got tough. Right. And so modern humans, if they're equipped with this technology with bone needles and as a proxy for these complex garments, they were certainly able to occupy distinct ecological niches in Eurasia and at a greater duration of the foraging season than their archaic ancestors.
And the introduction here talks about this, where essentially the way you have to survive back then is you can't just like throw hide over top of it. You have to fine tailor that to keep that microclimate on your body. You have to keep that heat as trapped into you as possible to stay alive. So I'll have him elaborate.
I guess to start off with, you have to make these garments if you want to survive the Ice Age conditions of Wyoming. There's really no way around it. If people were not making these garments, they wouldn't have been living here. We don't have the physiological capacity to deal with temperatures like that. One alternative would be to basically hibernate during the winter, hole up in a cave, remain inert under blankets, basically starving until the spring comes around. But obviously modern humans weren't doing that. Neanderthals might have done that. They might have gone through periods of sort of pseudo-hibernation, or at least torpor during the winter when they experienced a lot of dietary stress. Modern humans did not. It's very obvious in my view, that modern humans were out foraging, hunting, doing the things that hunter-gatherers do basically all year round in the most extreme weather conditions that you could imagine. In that regard, it's an extremely important tool because there's nothing else that you could use to make these sorts of garments other than a bone needle. There's other sorts of perforators, right? There's like stone perforators and there's awls. But if you want to get a really tightly spaced water and wind resistant seam, you have to have a needle that passes all the way through that seam so that you can thread that really fine piece of sinew all the way through it and keep doing that. Whereas with an awl, you're producing a hole that big. A needle, you're producing a hole that's, no more than 2 millimeters big. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very small kind of mundane aspect of a toolkit, but it's extremely important, as important as any other tool in the Paleolithic toolkit of people in Wyoming at that time.
I didn't know the Neanderthal thing. Can you elaborate on that real quick?
Yeah, I can. I haven't kept up with this literature as much, but there's this classic pattern in Neanderthal long bones, especially where you get Harris lines and bone growth, where it looks like there's regular periods of dietary stress throughout the adolescent period of Neanderthal development. And when you find those in modern populations, it means that people were starving on an annual basis, and basically their growth was inhibited because of that. And in the studies that I understand, the studies of Neanderthal long bones that have been done, a lot of juvenile Neanderthals have evidence of annual starvation. Since then, there's been some studies of Neanderthal, the structure of Neanderthal cancellous bone that seems to indicate, actually, I don't think it's Neanderthal, it's ancestor bone, like 900,000-year-old hominin species, archaic hominin species from Spain, that suggests that they have some characteristics of basically hibernating animals, where some of these archaic hominin species, I don't think we could think about them as hibernators in the sense of like a groundhog, but they were certainly experiencing annual periods of torpor where their metabolic rate probably dropped. They probably were on the verge of starvation the entire time. So in my mind, that was how archaic hominins coped with Ice Age conditions of Eurasia. They didn't produce these complex garments. They probably had some form of garments, like loose drape garments, but instead of being out foraging on the landscape during the winter, wearing these things to guard themselves against these cold temperatures, they probably just holed up in caves and huddled with their kin, tried to keep as warm as they could, tried to keep from starving. And then once the spring came around, they could kind of reemerge and start foraging again.
Next, we move on to methods and materials. We'll be right back. So methods and materials, the methods and materials section is going to go into a lot more detail about zooms and how they did this actual study on the bone itself. Now I'll let McKenna nerd out on this because she's like a genius at this, but I do want to just to paint a picture for you here. In the old days, I would take a dog, if I wanted to find, when you're at an archaeological site, you find like a bunch of shattered bones all over the place. Sometimes you're lucky and you find big ones and you can compare them. Usually you're like, oh, that's a deer. Like you can tell that's a bison, clearly. But when you have a bunch of pieces mashed and smashed over time with, sediment and water hitting them and people trampling them, they're fragments. And it's really hard to tell those fragments unless you have a very diagnostic piece of it, like a femoral head or something to tell exactly what it is. And then can you tell if it's left or right, if it's male or female? It's hard. But what you would do then is, let's say I found a couple of, canine teeth. I would take those canine teeth and then go to what's called a comparative collection. And I would look at the comparative collection, find dog, fox, wolf, maybe even look at bear as just a juxtaposition just in case, because, predator teeth do kind of all look similar. And you're looking at it, and I would like take that and look at coyote, I'd look at dog, I'd look at wolf, and then you're like, okay, it's not coyote, but I have, let's say it's a dog. I think it's a dog. Then I look at a wolf and I look at a domestic dog. And again, they're the same species. So it could just be a very big dog that looks like a wolf, or it could be a kind of a small wolf that looks like a dog. Hard to tell. That's a very easy example because you have a diagnostic, tooth. But if you just have a fragment, or let's say something that was times 54,000, grinded down from a fragment into a needle. McKenna is a literal genius at this stuff, and it's a new kind of science. I'll have her explain it here, but this is like cutting edge stuff right here, and I'll have her talk about it.
Sure. Yeah, my name is McKenna Latinsky, and I'm a second-year PhD student here at the University of Wyoming.
First things first, I asked McKenna, what's your understanding of this paper? How would you explain it to somebody?
Sure. Yeah. So this paper focuses on the bone needles from the Leprel mammoth site, and specifically identifying what animals these tools are created out of.
And I asked McKenna, what was your role in this research?
My role in this research was undertaking zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry on the bone needles, which allows for us to identify the needles where osteological markers aren't present. So basically, it involves extracting collagen from these bones, resulting in individual peptide signatures, which then we can analyze to compare and contrast to known animals, which allows for us to ID these animals.
This is like where science is going.
Yeah, so this specific technique, ZOOMS is the acronym, is really helpful when, you're right, these assemblages are very fragmentary, meaning we have no way to identify what animals these bones come from. But it can also be helpful in the case of bone tools, because these are created in such a way where these markers, these parts of the bones that allow us to identify them, aren't there.
And then again, I asked McKenna, what is the process of ZOOMS?
So the process of ZOOMS, in very simplistic terms, is you have this piece of bone and you extract collagen, which is an organic component of bone, from the specimen. Then we basically denature or untangle the triple helix structure of the collagen. Then we chop it up into little bits using an enzyme, and then we run that sample through an instrument known as a mass spectrometer, which results in a series of peaks on a screen. And basically those peaks represent the little bits of collagen that we chopped up. And by looking at those peaks and the relative position of them, we can compare the unknown set of peaks to multiple sets of known peaks from animals, and then we can identify them.
So if that doesn't make sense, the way ZOOMS works is you put it through step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and you science the shit out of it with and it tells you, basically, you break the bone down into bone goo, you use this solution that extracts this stuff, you put it in there, and then you stick that. And if you remember the episode of SpongeBob where Plankton is trying to get the recipe for the Krabby Patty, and he has that machine, he's taking the Krabby Patty, dropping it into the thing because it wants to tell him exactly what the ingredients are. He ends up falling in and it says, 1% evil, 99% hot gas or something like that. 99% evil, 1% hot gas. I forget what it is. That's the closest. ZOOMS is the closest thing we have to that right now. And either way, it's going to be destructive. This ZOOMS is a lot less destructive than I thought it would be. But if you have a very tiny thing like that, it's going to have a chunk cut out of it or part of it missing. It's not easy to find a bone fragment, pick it up and go, oh, this is mammoth. That's typical. If it's huge, yeah, it's a mammoth. But if it's just a fragment, what could it be? So, especially when you get down to the smaller and smaller taxa, like foxes and hares, like this paper talks about, it's incredibly hard. So this is the closest thing we have to scanning a barcode on it and being like, oh, rabbit. As stated in the beginning of the abstract and the introduction, they weren't sure what these, bones were going to be made of. So I asked McKenna, after you did this process, were you surprised to see what you found?
I was expecting the needles to be made out of either bison or some related ungulate. I wasn't expecting the needles to be made out of the mammoth that exists there, just because mammoths are ginormous and that would not make sense. But I was expecting, there's a specific bone in the bison foot called a metacarpal or a metatarsal. And it's a really long, kind of straight bone. And to me, that made an excellent choice for a needle.
Yeah, that's kind of like the cliche cartoonish looking bone you see.
Yeah.
Like dogs eat cartoons and stuff. Yeah.
It's a weird bone.
Yeah. And I was confused about this, so I had to have her clarify. Did they do the zooms specifically on that bone needle itself or other bones around the site and not destroy the bone needle? But here's her answering that.
Yes, so I was doing zooms on the needles themselves. So 2 of the needles we actually brought over to the University of Manchester. So my colleague Sarah Lawn and I worked closely with Michael Buckley, who's actually the inventor of this technology, and he helped us to extract the collagen in a way where we don't destroy the morphology of the needles. And then the remaining needles we did run here at the University of Wyoming.
And then I ask, is it destructive to do this to a bone needle?
Well, it kind of depends. Yeah.
Okay.
So those 2 needles that we brought over to the University of Manchester, we did successfully extract the collagen without destroying the actual shape of the needles. But when we tried to perform those same techniques here, we were unsuccessful. So then we went ahead and we did destroy small parts of the needle.
Sure. Yeah, gotta break eggs to make an omelet, I guess.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I'm working on it for my dissertation, so it's been better, sort of.
Now we're going to move on to results. Results is the section of the paper where, you've done your methods and materials, and here's the method in which you're going to do the research or the experiment or the, literature review. And then the results are the, what you got from that, literally the results. So were you surprised? I already asked that, to find that it was fox and cat?
I was very surprised to find that it was fox and cat and dog. Well, some sort of fox. Yeah. It's just mind-blowing to me.
Now that McKenna found out that it was actually fox, coyote bone, or hare bone that was, using these tools, I asked Spencer why. Why wouldn't it be mammoth? Why wouldn't it be, bison?
Well, the reason these results were so exciting to me was I had these 2 expectations of what we should find when people were making these garments, and it was bone needles and the bones of fur-bearing animals. And in our results, which show that these bone needles are made out of the bones of fur-bearing animals, we had kind of a convergence of those 2 lines of evidence in the same artifact. To be clear, and I don't think we made this clear in the paper, but it hasn't necessarily been made clear in the popular coverage of it. There are not bones of these animals in the site that we've identified other than in the needles. So we don't have a fox skull or a cat vertebra. We do have a couple hare bones, but not many. So it wasn't really even on our radar as a type of animal to find in this site. I think the reason why they ended up in this site and why they were turned into bone needles is because when you skin these fur-bearing animals, you typically leave the foot bones in place within the fur, because once you get down to the foot bones of a canid or a felid, they're really tiny and intricate little spacings in between them, so you can't really get the hide off of them. So what you typically do is you skin them down to the legs and then you lop off the feet. So I think that's how those bones ended up in this site in the first place, is that people were trapping these animals, skinning them for their hides specifically, bringing those hides back to camp, and then using these really conveniently sized foot bones that are still clinging to these furs to make the bone needles out of. So they could just remove the foot bone, incise down the length of that bone, maybe in a couple places, remove a splinter from it, abrade it down, and then you got a bone needle. If you're working with a mammoth or a bison bone, bison has kind of been the conventionally assumed material these are made out of, because bison bone just dominates sites of this age. It would have taken a lot more work. I mean, these are really thick the cortical bone on a bison, is half a centimeter thick or so. You got to basically shave that in half to get down to the size of a needle that you need. Yeah. So that's what I think happened. Basically, people were trapping these fur-bearing animals so that they could sew those furs into clothing. By the nature of how you skin those animals, you ended up with these perfect little bone needle preforms in the feet. You take them out, incise them, turn them into a needle, and then you basically use the bones of that animal to sew its own skin into a parka.
Yeah. And I guess I was talking with Spencer, he thinks they were trapping those animals and things like that. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that, as from what you studied and researched?
Sure, yeah. So it was very surprising that these needles were made out of fox and felids as well as jackrabbit, because to me, these are completely unrelated to the faunal assemblage itself at the site. This is a question that I'm postulating in my own dissertation research. So I'm trying to analyze awls and needles more broadly across Wyoming to see if they are following similar patterns or if they are reflecting these faunal assemblages. But the fact that they aren't reflecting them at La Prelle is pretty astonishing.
Because again, we think of Clovis people as these like mammoth hunting either with a spear or an atlatl or maybe a bow. Mammoth hunting, bison hunting people, or at least Paleo-Indians in general, not just Clovis. Ice Age hunters is how I picture them. I don't really stop to think like, oh yeah, they were probably trapping small game on the side too, either for sport or in this case, as Spencer points out, like it's really easy furs to trap and use, and it like, gives you more fur.
The trapping aspect of this, we know modern humans were able to trap stuff from a really early time, just because we end up with like rabbits and Paleolithic sites in Eurasia. Really the best way to trap a rabbit or to kill a rabbit is to trap it, unless you're doing it in like a big game drive situation. But trapping's never really been a big point of discussion in the early Paleo-Indian literature of North and South America. We have all these giant mammoth and bison kill sites, and they really dominate this record. And so a lot of the discussions about Paleo-Indian faunal use has been centered around those big charismatic fauna. And I think no doubt that comprised the vast majority of Paleo-Indian diets, was these big animals. But incorporating this whole other notion of trapping introduces kind of an entire other aspect to their hunting and like animal attainment system. It also suggests that people didn't just kill animals for food. They also killed some animals specifically for their hides or for their furs and basically material to make clothing out of. I think that's one important point of the study, is that just because you find, a rabbit bone or a fox bone in a Paleo-Indian site doesn't necessarily mean those things are being targeted as part of like this subsistence practice. They could be targeted specifically for thermoregulation.
No, these people were like highly mobile, chasing big megafauna across the landscape. How I wouldn't have thought that they would take the time to trap and do all these other things. Can you like speak to that a little more?
I guess that's how I'm thinking about it. I haven't given it a ton of thought, but you can imagine a model where, you are a highly mobile Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, kind of chasing mammoths and bison around. But once you achieve that goal, you can kind of sit on top of that kill for a while as you're processing hides and processing meat, living off of that kill. And so what do you do during that time? Well, a lot of people are invested in these tasks, processing hide and meat and stuff. But then you have this whole other segment of society that's just hanging out, like children, teenagers. I kind of view this whole trapping component of the economy as probably being conducted by those sorts of members of the society, where maybe you're not physically capable enough to embark on like a really strenuous bison or mammoth hunt or something like that. But you are capable of running a trap line, maybe leaving camp, going on kind of a little circuit, setting up traps around it, and then your job every day or a couple times a day is to go around and check those traps. Yeah. And it really rounds out kind of the Paleo-Indian life way in a really interesting way in my mind.
Now, a question I had for both of them, which, is kind of talked about in the paper, but it's left to your interpretation. When we think of, big game hunters like Clovis and Folsom hunting mammoth and bison, we kind of picture that they're just hunting the mammoth and the bison. So I was wondering, do you think it's more that they were just generalists and anything they could come across and we're only seeing the big mammoths because that's what remains kind of thing? There's more to that. I'm simplifying it, but here's her answer to that.
Whether or not people are selecting animals for opportunistic reasons is something that I'm trying to dive more into. I think there's a lot of different variables that go into why people select certain animals for tool production. One is they are readily available on the landscape, and people hunt them either for fur-bearing purposes, food purposes, etc., and they just use the remaining bones to craft these tools. Another reason might be the mechanics of the bone itself. So whether or not people can use these tools for longer periods of time due to bone structure influences, or how long it takes to produce the end result tool, depending on the element that they use, so the specific parts of the animal. And another reason might be pure symbolic or ritualistic purposes.
And I didn't even think about that, so I have her elaborate.
Yeah, so can I give a good example? Yeah. Okay, so a really good example that I'm finding in the ethnographic record, this particular group of people selected cougar skin to produce their clothing and their quivers for, and this was specifically for hunting magic, they claim. So people purposefully selected this animal not for thermoregulation capacity, but because these animals are magical to these hunters.
Sure, that's some kind of like sacred.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
So I don't know if that's what's happening at Leprel. I don't know if people selected these canids, felids, and jackrabbits because they thought they were magical per se, but it's something I'm thinking about in my broader research.
I'm going to read the conclusion. Put my glasses on. The conclusion. Our study is the first to identify the species and likely elements from which Paleo-Indians produced eyed bone needles. Bone needle production techniques have until this point been largely theoretical, based on incised bone objects argued to represent the bone needle preforms and experimental needle production. We were able to clarify some aspects of bone needle production techniques through the combined use of zooms and micro-CT scanning, and the first applications of both these technologies to the study of Paleo-Indian bone needles, but not beads. Okay. Oh, that's right, there were beads there too. Beads are cool. Our results are strong evidence for tailored garment production using bone needles and fur-bearing animal pelts. Such garments might have looked comparable to those of the Inuit, like I called it, who sewed fur-bearer pelts into the fringes of parkas, whose base material was typically comprised of ungulate hide, probably caribou, and moose, and used them for hats and mittens. The cold conditions of the North American Younger Dryas and northerly latitudes likely inspired a greater reliance on such garments, and the sparse early Paleo-Indian archaeological records suggest the relative abundance of bone needles and fur bearers in Younger Dryas age sites relative to periods before and after. Finally, our results have some relevance to the debate surrounding early Paleo-Indian subsistence. The presence of fur bearers in the early Paleo-Indian sites has been argued to support the existence of a broad spectrum subsistence base characterized on generalist rather than specialist diets. So, essentially, they're going on anything they can find rather than one thing only. Mammoth and bison, i.e. Our results are a good reminder that foragers use animal products for a wide range of purposes other than subsistence, and that the mere presence of animal bones in an archaeological site need not be indicative of diet. So, to put that whole paper, into perspective with all the data and stuff here, which I can throw up the tables, I can throw up all that, we can talk, you can go back and watch the interviews again. They found a bone needle, figured maybe it was bison or mammoth. They did very fancy science on it to find out that actually, it wasn't. It was fox, coyote, and hare, and other small animals. And then that kind of gives us a better idea of, okay, they weren't just hunting mammoth and bison. They were actually hunting a lot of other animals on the landscape, and not just hunting them for food. They were either using them for, a ritual purpose, to use those hides for, maybe someone just wants to wear a wolf pelt over their head. I would. But also, as Spencer pointed out, foxes and small animals like that are easier to manipulate and then tan and use their bone utility later on, and they're smaller. You don't have to grind it down already from a huge ass bison bone down to a fox bone. And like you said, you're just pulling the fur right over it and stuff. So it is interesting because we do, in hindsight, think of, mammoth hunters as just big, dudes on the plains hunting, either poking them with a spear, throwing an atlatl, maybe doing fire traps or something elaborate. But they're also, maybe while that's going on and they're tanning the bison hide, other people are going out, maybe kids, women, or other men going out and, trapping foxes and things like that because they need those extra furs and extra bone tools too. And why not? Because, then Clark gets to have a, fox pelt with him. So, yeah, that's how you read an academic paper. I know I kind of like breezed through that, but I'll put the paper. I'll link it here in the description if you want to read it and follow along yourself. But there's no need for me to like read the whole thing and tell you how to do it. So what you need to do is read the abstract, and then you want to read the introduction, and then you want to read the figures, because the figures show you, what's going on in the paper and the science of it. After the figures, you read the conclusion, and then if you really want to check the data, you can. You just trust them on the data, or, if you have an issue with the data, then you go into the data tables and you're like, that doesn't add up there. So anyway, this paper means a lot to me, and I wasn't on it by any means, but I was there when they dug this needle up, and it means a lot to me because, they let me come out to these sites and I can, dig and film and do whatever the hell I want usually, which is nice, within reason. And I get to, film all this stuff out there to be able to use it in videos when I'm teaching you this kind of stuff here. But anyway, this one means a lot to me because I filmed that moment where we found that bone needle, and I was like, oh, this would be cool. And it went viral on TikTok. It went viral on Instagram because it was just a cool, and it was the viral sound at the time. I forget the song. I want to say it was M83 or something, but, and, Camille commented that, being like, and that's the point of like why I do this. I want to show, like mosaics are sexy, and like people buried in ash at Pompeii is like fucking metal. But like the bone needle here is so, and you saw how hard it was for Donnie to make that. It took forever, and you got to like use that. And then, especially when it's freezing in the ice age and you're sitting by the fire, and like my fingers get all fucked up when I'm cold and I'm trying to like sew and stuff, it's very difficult. So like, yeah, Camille's right. It is a very important piece of like, it's so integral to life in the past. And like this paper kind of, doesn't exactly shine like on how important the bone needle is, but it's also the research. But sometimes here's where I'm going with that. The doing this research and doing a paper on this kind of stuff and putting time into the research, you do find things you didn't expect. And that's the point of science. And they didn't expect it being a fox or a hare or whatever. So it does add to our picture of Paleo-Indians in the past being more generalists than they were specialists, which is pretty damn cool. And I did learn from Donnie, who's my caveman guy and like my wilderness expert dude, who I have on speed dial, which is fun. Whenever I'm, hey man, how do I hit this rock better? And he'll literally send me a video. He'll tell me too, like when you're out in the wilderness trying to survive, like a fish trap gives you passive calories. Like you can go hunting all day looking for something, but if you don't have that fish trap when you get back and you didn't get that deer, you're not going to have food. So you might as well leave those passive calories there doing that. So these people, back in the day, if they didn't hunt the mammoth that day, or, it was been 3 weeks without meat or something like that, they do have other options of hunting, either fox, hares and things like that. But not only that, are they, like it says in the paper, maybe they're not subsisting on this, but they're using it for their tool utility, because everyone used not that they used every part of the animal back then, but you know what I'm trying to say, like the natural world around you is what you had to make tools out of. And humans, our adaptation is to make tools to survive and adapt to our environments. And this site at La Prelle is one of the coolest examples of humans adapting to their environment I've ever had the pleasure to dig at, but also learn about. And that's why I went to school here. So please rate and review the podcast on Spotify. You can leave comments now on Apple. I don't think you can. Here on YouTube, please subscribe. If you're not subscribed, please sub. And if you, haven't shared this podcast with other people, whether you listen to it on Apple or Spotify or YouTube, please share it. I would greatly appreciate that. You can get my merchandise on my website, which is davidianhowe.com/store. And see you next week. Thank you to the APN, and follow any other podcast you'd like to listen to archaeology-wise on the Archaeology Podcast Network. You can go to archpodnet.com. Thank you.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Culturo Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.